I was asked to talk about the costs of the Clean Power Plan in about 15 minutes. And it kind of reminded me of, since I'm at a law school, of a Talmudic story about a rabbi once asked to summarize the entire Torah, the Hebrew Bible, while standing on one foot. And I was trying to think, well, how am I going to do this? Well, if I had to do it on one foot, and I won't embarrass myself by trying to stand on one foot, I would say, the costs of the Clean Power Plan, as estimated by the EPA itself, were about somewhere between $5 and $10 billion per year as the net cost to society. If you look at the emission consequences, which I'm guessing you guys were spending all of yesterday looking at, it was about 300 to 500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So if you just do a crude calculation of how much per ton these regulations would cost, it's somewhere between $10 and $30 per ton as the average cost. That is completely in line with what we would expect from this level of emission reductions, 10, 20% emission reductions in the power sector. So there's no real reason to doubt the overall cost estimates that the EPA is providing, to a rough order. But what I'm going to spend the next 15, so that would be my 1 foot version. And then what I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes, which will be closer to 2 feet, I guess, is just talking about some questions and issues that arise when we think about the costs of a regulation like this. And I guess the first thing I would point out is that it's an enormously complicated regulation. It's complicated in part because the EPA is using this somewhat unusual piece of the Clean Air Act to craft guidelines that states are then going to comply with by proposing their own plans. And the EPA has tried to promote both flexibility but also ambition in developing these guidelines. And that creates a lot of question marks in terms of exactly how the states are going to respond and what exactly they're going to do. So when you're trying to figure out the costs, of course, that is going to raise a lot of issues. And it's actually in very sharp contrast to the situation we were in a few years ago, where we were talking about national legislation, and the Congress was going to tell everybody exactly what to do. We didn't have all these questions about exactly what was going to happen as the regulation was implemented. And another really interesting feature about this dichotomy between the EPA proposing or creating guidelines and the states actually designing and proposing implementation is it's not even necessary that the volume of emissions is going to be constant depending on what choices the EPA makes. So a lot of times we talk about design choices and how we can come up with cheaper ways to achieve the same outcome. And one of the unusual things we'll see in a couple of slides is that depending on the kinds of choices that the states make, it may actually be easier in the sense that they have to do fewer emission reductions. So that's yet another reason why this is particularly complicated. So what kinds of choices am I thinking about here that are going to affect the cost of these regulations? And there are 4 that I put up here. I should actually put a 0th, I guess. Thanks to Mitch McConnell, it may just be the response is fight and don't do anything. But assuming that states take the EPA guidelines and then try to craft a policy response within their state, there are kind of 4 key decisions that I think about that are going to affect the costs and as well as the benefits, because they will affect emissions as well. The first is whether or not they're going to do a market-based policy. The EPA gives states the flexibility to use traditional regulation where they just say, you power plant are going to do this and you other power plant are going to do that. But they also give the states the possibility of using flexible approaches where power plants may be given some initial targets, but then the power plants can trade those targets amongst themselves to find cheaper ways of complying. So one big question is whether or not the regulations that the states implement are going to be market-based or not. A second big question is whether or not states are going to comply by themselves or whether or not they're going to band together into either regional or even maybe a national cooperative system. Cooperation usually will see reduce the costs of compliance for the state as a whole, although a very important question that we can come up with, we can come back to maybe during the Q&A, is even as we save money for the state as a whole, there could be different stakeholders in the process that actually end up worse off. The third question, which is kind of an interesting one for economists to think about because it isn't something that would naturally arise when you're designing policies, is whether or not the states will choose to include only existing power plants or all the power plants, i.e. existing and new. This turns out to be a weird feature of the Clean Air Act that new sources are regulated separately from old sources. And so the regulation that we're talking about largely right now is how the existing source regulation is going to be implemented, and yet it has very important consequences, as we'll see. In particular, new sources are the ones that frequently are setting the price of electricity in wholesale markets, and that may have a large consequence for what happens to electricity prices. And then the last point, which I think is something that Mark may be talking a bit more about, is whether or not if states pursue a market-based policy, whether they are going to pursue a rate-based approach, that is regulate emissions per megawatt hour, where some power plants may be above and other power plants are below, but on average they have this average emission rate, or whether it's actually a total emissions cap for the regulated sources. If it's a rate, then the total emissions are going to vary depending on how many megawatt hours you actually have. So the actual mass level is not fixed. So mass here just refers to the mass of carbon dioxide. So these are the choices, the key choices I think that states face that are going to affect costs, as I'll discuss in a second. But then there are all these different notions of costs, right? A second ago when I said $5 billion or $10 billion a year in costs, what I was referring to was the net cost to society. But in reality, there are a lot of different parts to society. If you're regulating power plants, you might be thinking about the upstream suppliers of fuels, in particular coal miners, if we're in Appalachia, and coal mining communities. We might be thinking directly about the generators. We were talking about TVA just a second ago. And we might be thinking about the downstream users of electricity that could face higher electricity prices. And finally, we may be thinking even about government budgets if we're thinking about policies that either could cost revenue, if we're thinking about demand-side policies or other government incentives, or if we're thinking about policies that could auction allowances in a market-based system. So power plants actually have to buy the right to emit. In that case, there could be government revenue. So you kind of have all these costs and benefits accruing to different people. You add them up, benefits are pluses, costs are minuses, or I guess you could do it the other way around, and you come up with a net cost to either a region, such as Tennessee, or if you add up all the regions, to the country as a whole. And depending on who you care about and which constituent you are, these different ways of adding it up may make a big difference to you. And one thing I'll just mention here is that, I said a second ago the total cost of society would be around maybe $5 to $10 billion, and I was pretty confident that was right. These individuals could experience costs and benefits many times that $5 billion, especially if we're using a market-based policy that, for example, auctions allowances. The losers could be losing tens of billions of dollars, whereas there could be winners actually making tens of billions of dollars, even as the net cost stays in that $5 to $10 billion per year range. So net costs are one thing, but cost to you and me, that could be something entirely different. Okay, so let's look at some of these things and try to draw some conclusions, or some summary points, I guess, in the limited amount of time that we have. So this is some results from a study that was actually just published, I think, yesterday by some colleagues at the Nicholas Institute. So if you're interested, you can go to the Nicholas Institute website. I think I put the little short URL on the title slide. And you can download the report. But they looked at a number of these different design questions in this report, and I'll just be summarizing a few that I thought were kind of cool. So what you see here is a bar graph, and I've only highlighted 2 bars. The different bars are going to be different ways states choose to implement the Clean Power Plan. And on the right side, the 4 bars that we'll see in a second are all going to be states going it alone and not cooperating with their neighbors, whereas the left side at this moment is going to be assume some sort of national cooperation. I mean, you could assume regional cooperation. You'd see very similar things, but it's some sort of cooperative effort. And what I've highlighted right here for the first slide is what happens if you have a normal mass-based emissions trading scheme like people have talked about in the past, including all sources, and what happens if you implement that at a state-by-state versus a national level. And the basic conclusion is that cooperation lowers total costs. And here you see a decline of maybe half a percentage point from a little over 2% to a little bit less than 2%. Not huge, but some savings by allowing cooperation across state lines. Now, if we fill in all these other blanks, we'll see a kind of crazy pattern of different costs. But there are a couple of things, or at least one thing I want to highlight, aside from this fact that generally cooperation lowers total costs, and that is that what we see in this graph, and again, maybe Mark is going to tackle this a bit more, is that the rate-based policies turn out to be a lot more expensive than the mass-based policies, at least as this modeling looked at it. And the reason is pretty simple. The rate-based policies, in this case, are assumed to be different rates in different states. I know, it's kind of catchy, right? Different rates in different states. And the rate-based policy acts as a subsidy to generation in that state. That is, every time you generate a megawatt hour, you get the right to emit half a ton or a quarter of a ton. And that acts like a small incentive, a positive incentive to generate electricity. There's also the emissions you have to deal with on the back end, but you get some positive incentive to generate. And different states have different rates, so different states have different incentives to generate electricity. This completely warps the pattern of generation across the states and leads to much higher costs of meeting the same standard because you're basically shifting generation because of these differing rates and not because of cheaper mitigation options. Now you see a different weird pattern when you start looking at, well, what happens if we include existing versus all? It seems like it's somewhere in the middle. Maybe mass is actually more expensive. Well, this goes to the point I made at the very beginning, which is these different implementation, these different policy choices that states may make actually have different consequences for emissions. And this is just the design of the policy and the way EPA is specifying it. This shows you, this is a graph, again, from this modeling that some colleagues at Nicholas did. And it shows you the path over the next 30 or 40 years of emissions. The black line is the baseline, what would happen in the absence of any regulation. And then the different dashes and dots, or different dashes and solid lines, are the different choices that states may make. In particular, the blue lines are rate-based policies. The red lines are mass-based policies. So one thing you see is that over time, at least according to the way the EPA has specified it, the rate-based policies become easier. And there's kind of a natural logic in that because rate-based policies accommodate growth a little bit more easily. That is, if you're regulating the total mass of emissions and you just say the mass cannot go up at all, well, the mass is not going to go up at all, and you kind of see that over time. Whereas if you regulate the rate, as we generate more electricity in the future, it actually allows emissions to rise over time. And so that's why you see the rate-based regulation going up a bit. The other thing you see, and that kind of explains the previous graph, is that the mass-based program, including all sources, is actually much more stringent in terms of the emission reductions. It's close to 1,500 million tons versus the rate-based policy, including all, that is the blue dotted line, which only gets to maybe 1,700 million metric tons. So just the way EPA has specified this and the way you translate rate to mass achieves a lot more emission reductions when you do a mass. So even though mass is cheaper, generally for the same emission reductions, when you require it to do a lot more work, it's actually going to be more expensive. So when you see these the rate versus mass, including all sources, they actually look fairly similar, but they're getting different amounts of emission reductions. The mass-based policy for the same money is getting another 200 million metric tons in this case. So, I could go on, and you guys would probably shoot me, but I want to make one more substantive point and then just wrap up, and then we can talk about all this stuff in the Q&A or other things that may be more interesting to you. As I mentioned, we may not care about the total cost of society. One thing a lot of people care about is what happens to electricity prices and consumers that have to buy electricity. Well, in Tennessee, I guess you guys have not deregulated, so this is not as relevant for you. But what happens to wholesale electricity prices is if you have a mass-based policy where for every ton you emit, you need an allowance, and you include new sources, which at the margin are going to be new natural gas plants typically, those new natural gas plants under a mass-based system have to buy allowances. Even if they don't have to buy allowances, they have to think about the opportunity cost of those allowances, and that's going to raise prices. So the thing that you see here is the one policy that has much higher prices. This is electricity price on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal. The one policy that you see, the one policy combination that you see having much higher prices over time is if you have a mass-based system that includes all sources, that is existing and new. And the fact that these new sources that are at the margin setting the price of electricity in the wholesale market, that's going to raise wholesale prices. The other policies don't really have much of an effect. Rate-based policies can actually depress electricity prices, at least over the short run. But these are all small compared to that mass-based policy that includes all sources. Now, of course, if you have regulated markets and you take all those allowances and you give the revenue back to the distribution companies, they can depress the electricity prices back. And so a lot is going to depend on what you do with the allowance revenue, whether or not it really does make any difference in retail electricity prices. So just to summarize some thoughts, first of all, as I said at the beginning, we can talk about total cost of society, but each of us has very different particular interests, and different costs are going to matter to different people. The second big thing is that the costs really depend a lot on the choices that states make. Now, they're all going to be in this ballpark of maybe $10 to $30 per ton of carbon dioxide, but first of all, $10 to $30 is a factor of 3, and second of all, as I mentioned, under the Clean Power Plan, the design choice can affect the required emission reductions. So it's a big difference if you're getting another 200 million tons of reductions or not. Generally, trading lowers the net cost to society. And the other thing that we saw is that if we have a program like the Clean Power Plan where states implement rate-based regulation, rate-based trading, that is tons per megawatt hour, and different states have different rates, that creates an enormous distortion in the market for energy, for electricity, and leads to much higher costs to society. And then finally, just this last point we were talking about, which is that regulating emissions through a typical cap and trade that includes all sources generally raises wholesale electricity prices the most, but the effect on end users is going to depend on what you do with the revenue and whether or not you're in a regulated state or not. So with that, I'll stop. I'll turn it over to Mark, and then we can come back to stuff maybe during the Q&A.